47 countries in the Bologna process commit to this when they go to the ministerial meetings. And this is an interesting trend that since World War II, there's been this term in education literature, massification of higher education, and how can the state deal with massification? How can it fund more masses of people going through and prepare them to be productive in the economy? Because if you think traditionally, 50 to 100 years ago, higher education was more for elites in the population, but there's been a broadening and a widening of higher education. Those are the two drives. And then the barriers that make this difficult are, as usual, as we know, in times of austerity, funding. But what's interesting about the Bologna process, it is still up to the nation states to fund this higher education. Unlike Erasmus, which is a student mobility initiative funded by the European Commission, the Bologna process doesn't really have a line item in the EU budget. You may use structural funds or cohesion funds for universities, but there's not a line item in the EU budget. So just like traditionally higher education funding has fallen on the states, it still falls on the states, and education is one of those issue areas protected by the subsidiary principle of the EU. So though it has been a national priority traditionally, and it still is, education, there's an effort to coordinate, and thus the open method of coordination has been a guideline, and that method came into effect with the Lisbon process. But beyond funding, I've read some literature that says there's a funding policy gap. So there's not funding, but there's not really ideas for how to meet the funding challenges. One thing that's taken place in many countries is that the first bachelor's degree, all countries have a bachelor's degree now, is generally free as it's always been, but to go for a master's or PhD, it's more cost to students. So the tuition cost has gone up to students. That's been a way to deal with funding policy gap. And then stakeholders, student groups have resisted that, and various stakeholders, be they academic, public, and private, have different positions on this issue. And then political and economic uncertainty about the EU. I think it's a tangential barrier. I find that organizational capacity and leadership are more important, but I think it's tangential because 47 countries, many of them are beyond the EU itself, and there's an interest to continue this even if the future of the EU may change. But it's easy, to think about and wonder how the uncertainty in the EU influences EU countries and the neighborhood. Last year, the Miami EU Center of Excellence made a book, The State of the Unions, ? Which was a really interesting and important book about what is the future of the EU given our uncertainty in economic and political circumstances. So it is important to consider, even though it's probably not the strongest barrier to implementation. And then in this research, I divided the countries into 4 groups to compare how political economy factors influence tertiary education completion. It's arguable where the countries may go. They're just in these groups for balance, but I know France could be Central European, and the Baltic states could be Central rather than Eastern. But for this research, I used dummy variables, 4 dummy variables, and I coded them, the countries this way. And then this is one research question I asked, and the regression model I used. In the regression model, I took the dummy variables and I interacted each region with each independent variable 4 times. So I have 4 models that I compare that I'll show you. But my research question, as I've explained, are what are the political and economic explanations for achieving the criteria in higher education reform for countries in the Bologna process? And particularly here, the criteria of interest is the 40% tertiary education completion rate. And then, informed by path dependency and historical institutionalism, I have the hypothesis that if there are positive macroeconomic indicators, then educational reforms will correspond positively on a path-dependent trajectory. On the other side, it's possible to say that countries may be catching up that are performing weaker, and they may catch up faster. So I know that's the other side of this hypothesis, but my research has informed the one that's here. And the variables I'll mention quickly that influence are government spending in education, that's at the national level, investment in R&D at the national level. All of these are actually at the national level. Trade as a percentage of our GDP, employment, which is positive. If you have positive employment, how does it affect positive tertiary education completion, GDP per capita, and population? So I wonder how all of these affect tertiary education completion. And the next models, the next slides will just show the regression output in 2 slides, and then I'll tell you my conclusions from this output, and then we'll be done. But you'll see here the northern and the central, and then next will be the eastern and the southern. But it's interesting on all three, except for southern, employment and tertiary education have a negative relationship, which may not be surprising. And GDP per capita is very important. But I meant to mention before I showed these that I ran a statistical test, that Wooldridge test, to see if there's autocorrelation, and there is high autocorrelation among these variables. So that makes it hard to see the true effect of these variables, and particularly R&D over GDP and GDP per capita are highly autocorrelated. So that may take away some of the effect of R&D over GDP. But I can show you these in more detail later if you want to see. And then these are the eastern and the southern countries. Again, across all slides, employment and GDP per capita are significant, 3 stars being most significant, but employment is actually positively correlated with tertiary education completion in the southern countries. And I wonder if that's because, they track each other more. In other countries, even countries that have very high tertiary education completion, like UK or France or Spain. Well, actually UK is northern, France and Spain are southern, but UK, for example, the R&D over GDP is just less than 2%, and the same with Ireland. UK and Ireland have high tertiary education completion and less R&D over GDP. So, not to confuse those. So I've mentioned this already. I think it makes logical sense that usually when there's more people working, there's less people in higher education, and that's been true except for the southern countries. And then the importance of GDP per capita, I think, is important to remember that wealthier countries where there's more funds available per person do have an easier time having more graduates. But it was interesting to find that education spending at the national level was not significant, even though GDP per capita was. Future research may look at that more closely to figure out why. And then the negative coefficient in each model of R&D over GDP indicates a reverse relationship with tertiary education, which really makes me wonder about that. There may be a new way to run the statistics, but perhaps the goals for R&D over GDP haven't been met yet, but over time, if those goals are met and the indicators increase along tertiary education, perhaps we'll see a positive relationship. But at this time, we see a negative relationship with R&D over GDP and tertiary education completion. And if you want to read more, you can read about Europe's 2020 economic growth strategy. And the recent Bologna process Bucharest Ministerial Conference has all the documents for the Bologna process and all the communiques and the commitments. And then the European higher education area has national reports about each country's progress on the goals and the criteria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, for 3 excellent presentations. Let's start the questions. Dr. Roy.
Thank you for the Ms. Barret, be willing, to rehearse her defense for the dissertation shortly. And it's a very simple question. Is this Bologna process, in your view, to make the life of the Europeans more comfortable and be richer and advancement and all this, or it was done to build, to reinforce European integration?
What I've read, that's a great question. I think that both those goals can go side by side. I think definitely the first, because to improve people's quality of life and productivity in the economy and a knowledge economy, education is definitely necessary, and it's a push by the state to have coordination among countries where there's already this high degree of regional integration in the common market. So I think you can answer those two questions together, because I see the Bologna process as complementing the common market. And that's an economic dimension of education, and it's important to mention the social dimension of education too, because education is always important for social cohesion and teaching nationalism, and that's where studies about national identity and European identity are very interesting and applicable, because the Bologna process is a European idea, but national governments are cooperating. So perhaps they retain some of their national identity and have European identity both, which they've been doing over years and over decades since the Schuman Declaration. So I think they're both possible. Yeah.
So I have a question about
drum roll.
it's a drum. Now it's not, right? All right. I have a question about Mediterranean and Eastern Partnership, because I did some research on it, and actually I participated in a couple of projects with this employee exchange, not only part of labor unions, but only part of organizations.
I'm sorry. Leave it
It's
for the
fine,
air.
it's fine.
We had to rush to the airport with
Valerie has to go with her flight is
Fine.
Okay, continue, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's, I would have rather comment maybe than a question, because you got this number that the cooperation and networking is more dense in Mediterranean than in Eastern European countries. I would suggest, like my idea is that the reason for it is that Eastern European countries are less eager to learn, if I could say. Let me explain my ideas. Meaning that from my personal experience when I was in this type of projects, European Union countries, because it was Project Poland Belarus, right? They come to Belarus trying to teach or to show how it should be done. So instead of being actually partners or have the learning process in both directions. And I would say that the Eastern European countries have also something to teach another direction, especially again Poland, Belarus. There are examples that could be learned other ways around, but the idea how they expose their cooperation might be the reason why it's like that. I mean, if you have any questions.
Should we answer now?
Maybe we could, yeah, go ahead.
Well, we call that in our study cultural differences,
Right.
and it's one of the questions in our survey. We're still processing the results, so I'll just say that, but we do find that there's a lot more cultural differences in the Eastern Partnership. So so Belarusian authorities or Belarusian NGOs are much more suspicious of Polish NGOs in this particular case, because they view the world in a different way and they have to deal with a different political environment. So cultural differences are an important part of why they don't communicate with each other, why they don't cooperate. But I would like to stress again that time is very important as well, because sometimes these partnerships to be built, it takes getting to know these organizations. They need to know each other, and sometimes there's a reputation. These networks work, so let's join them. And so these cultural differences can be overcome. I mean, if different countries in North Africa can work together, I mean, so can different countries in the Eastern Partnership. It just takes time. So
you wouldn't say that there is this like one-way learning process?
from the EU to the countries, yeah, of course, yeah. Well, that's the.
But then why is it called partnership?
Well, there's literature about that, and so we actually our first paper,
right?
if I may say, is we're looking at the idea of partnership and the idea of conditionality, and we're trying to find out which one is more prevalent in those networks. So conditionality is hierarchical, partnership is, it evokes some sort of sense of equality, and we find that actually, although it's officially called a partnership, in reality those networks are very hierarchical. So if I were to show you some of the other networks we looked at, you'll find that in that diagram in the end, the commission is this big dot. And every organization has contacts with the commission. And then we find that it's not just that they have contact, but information goes from the Commission to the civil society organizations and not from the civil society organizations to the Commission.
That's why they might be resistant to cooperate.
But over time, what happens is the Commission shrinks, so it becomes less important in this relationship, and then regional, other organizations pop up in the networks as important. So centrality moves from the Commission to these other regional organizations. So definitely conditionality is very important, the partnership, but it changes over time.
I think maybe we'll collect a few questions because I already have a little list. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So,
That lady, she raised.
oh, you were first, and then my student, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes.
My question was for Dr. Shaw. I know that you talk in the context of Africa, but I was wondering if you maybe illustrate a little bit about this new regionalism, but in regards to South America. We know that Brazil is part of this debate, but we know there's a lot of other countries there that are now having a really interesting political moment and economic moment. So if you could share your thoughts about that.
All right. Dr. Shaw, thanks for amazing information about this African Renaissance, which is very fairly new. My question is about, whenever we talk about agency, structure comes to my mind, and also I'm thinking about structure right now, and how do you think that African rising into an agency will get reflected in the structure of the international system? Because, when we talk about Africa, as you stressed out, that Africa is the first time that we're talking about Africa as an agency, and that colonization of Africa was caused by, a lot of the scholars say, by structure. That is, the structure in the European continent resulted with the colonization of Africa, and now we're talking about African agency, and I'm just wondering, how do you think, what's going to be the response of the structure to this agency? Thank you.
Take one more.
Thank you all of you for the presentation. My question is for the three of them, and I would like to know what is your opinion about innovation versus imitation. Because this conference was about competitive and innovation, but the new dilemma in terms of your respective topics is what is regardless imitation. In different contexts, it could be as well.
Thank you. I'm very glad that even on a Friday afternoon we're having this kind of discussion. And certainly it seems to me, having worked in the Caribbean for 4 years, and having been in Trinidad and had meetings around the Summit of the Americas, that many of these parallels to Africa can be found in South America, as was indicated today in the case of UNICE. And I think similarly in Asia around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, even SARC, the Association for Regional Development in South Asia, has been expanding by including Afghanistan, and certainly, obviously, the case of Turkey is helping to redefine some of the parts of the old Silk Route and Central Asia. As also indicated today, I think the role of the EU vis-à-vis CELEC is quite important. In terms of structure of the global system, clearly symbolized by the G20, but also I think in a number of other ways in terms of the range of alphabet soup around emerging economies. Africa's agency, as well as I think the rise of the global south, can be seen in a variety of ways, and particularly in the African case, unlike the Caribbean, the difficulty of the EU, reinforced by the problems of the Eurozone, in getting the African states to sign EPAs. Obviously, historically, in terms of Cotonou, Lomé, ACP, etc., most of the early generation of African leaders sign whatever the European Union put in front of them. That is no longer the case. So it seems to me that the very fact that there is innovation in Africa and a resistance to innovation coming from Europe is symbolic of a new Africa. I think the question about innovation versus copying is also very relevant, and that's why I think in the African case, things like the African mining vision, things like the Eastern African energy possibility, things like the trilateral free trade area, again, are very innovative as opposed to borrowing from elsewhere. They come very much from within, including non-state actors as well as state actors. And certainly in the case of Africa, as elsewhere in the global south, the rise of mobile telecommunications is in a sense symbolic of the adaptability of those communities, and obviously the rise of parallel rise of social media.
So regarding the innovation or imitation question, I think the Bologna process has a bit of both. I think the long-term strategy of the Bologna process, or medium-term, together with the medium-term strategy of Europe 2020, is somewhat innovative, following up on the Lisbon process. And it's innovative in the sense that this higher education cooperation is being copied a model for regional cooperation in other parts of the world. Already there's Mercosur Educativo. It has some aspects of Bologna process, and ASEAN is discussing the idea about higher education cooperation as well. So just like in modern history, the European Union led the world and regional cooperation, starting with Konstantinos Thiel, expanding into politics, now in higher education. That higher education model that the EU has provided in the region of Europe is being experimented with in other regions. We've seen it already, particularly in South America and Asia, as I said. Thanks. And then as far as the imitation aspect, you can look in Europe itself to Asia and to the US. And you can look northward in Europe and see the success of the Nordic countries and highly educated societies and high investment in R&D. And there's this, this fascination with Finland and populations being very well educated and very homogenous, but very successful in R&D and innovation. So you look there into the other Nordics, Denmark as well as exemplary. In the Bologna process, since the last ministerial meeting, they decided to have a group of pathfinder countries. They haven't been designated yet, but the pathfinder countries will have achieved all the criteria first and shown the path of the other countries. Because as I mentioned, there are many criteria, and there's various timing on achieving the criteria. But there will be imitation even within Europe in the Bologna process. And then I say look to Asia, because South Korea, alongside Finland, has high achievement in education at every level, not only tertiary education, but primary. And then imitation, and some people say the Bologna process is an Americanization of the European education system, because in the US, our credits and degrees are basically transferable in the 50 states, and particularly the partnership with industry and the research incubation at universities is something that Europe would like to copy as well. But that partnership between universities and private industry, more than universities and the state funding research, is something that's gone back since World War II and years, manufacturing World War II in the US. So that will be interesting to see if and how Europe can bring about those research partnerships. Will they be with the state, which is limited in resources, or can they get the partnerships with the private sector? Does the private sector have the funds? Because the private sector does have many partnerships in the US, so that's a model for the research relationship.
Yeah, if you look at it, in the case of our networks, the imitation versus innovation, if you look at it from the perspective of the entire network, what you have is essentially imitation, because you have the transfer of practice from one part of the network to another. And in fact, the paradigm that we rely on is called institutional isomorphism. So that's sort of the headline of the paradigm. But if you look at the network level, it's imitation. But if you look at it from the perspective of individual actors in the network, particularly those who are recipients of those practices, then it's innovation, because this transfer of practice from one organization to another is new. but it's not innovation in the sense that new ideas are created from scratch. So I would say it's mostly imitation, less innovation, but it also is a matter of perspective. You look at the network or the individual actor.
I'm going to ask a question. I'd like to do that, and then I'll turn it up to open to you. I have a question, first of all, for Beverly. You mentioned something about this idea of post-World War II, the massification of higher education. Well, I think now, at least in the U.S., and I'm curious if this is true in Europe as well, not so much the massification, but the marketization, is that a word, of education, that, as you suggested, these very increasingly tight partnerships between universities and private industries, and how I would argue, and not me alone, that essentially what that is doing is creating new hierarchies within U.S. educational structure, where you have the flagships and the elite institutions who don't need to partner with private industries, and then there's everybody else who increasingly does, and that has significant implications for things like academic freedom and so forth, right? So that's, and I'm wondering if there are kind of similar kinds of things going on within Europe, I guess is what I'm asking, and what impact that has on the Bologna process and its goals. And then I have a quick one for emphasis, if I may. I want your provocative neo-corporatist model, and you can say more about that. Do you mean to be provocative, and why? And now we open it up. Okay, others. We're collecting. Please, sir.
I enjoyed obviously all the presentations. I guess the one that I find most interesting, just because it's so close to my own research, is the network paper, because I do social network analysis myself, and my dissertation was a social network analysis of homeland security policy. So I can talk to you later more about specific technical issues, obviously, but in general, I thought each one of the papers was interesting in their own right, but I wanted to leave a question for all the participants. What would be the one thing, because it's so diverse, that you would want me, for example, as not a specialist in terms of your areas, to take away from your particular paper? What would be the thing that, the takeaway or the aha moment, if you will, that you came to?
Okay, maybe one more if there is, and then we'll answer. Please.
A quick question for Beverly. Why did you decide to run the regressions by dividing the groups into different regions instead of having a big N?
Okay. The aha moment.
Yeah, just that I would argue that African agency is symptomatic of the way in which the Global South is bringing about rebalancing, restructuring of the global food economy, which is probably only just beginning.
First, Dr. Friedman's question about university partnerships. They are stronger traditionally in the U.S. than anywhere in the world. And another interesting aspect about the U.S. compared to the European system is that the accreditation system, it's a peer-reviewed system. The state doesn't have such a role, except for with state universities to have some governance and to get some funding, but sort of like if your qualifications are good enough and if you recognize the degree, I understand that that's regionally, peer-reviewed in the U.S. rather than the state having a role in that. So I say that leading to the fact that even with research in Europe, I think so much of research has been state-sponsored, and when I interviewed people in private industries, they said that often they relied on the state to give funds for research and development. So I don't think they've had this historical tradition of private businesses partnering with universities in Europe as they've done in the U.S. over the decades. So it will be like a cultural shift and a paradigm shift if they have the funds and they want, and they think it's in their interest to partner private sector with universities in Europe. And it is happening somewhat, but it depends across countries and across businesses. But there has been concern in the literature that yes, when private industries partner, then they influence the research agenda, right? So, you're seeking a grant from someone with certain interests, so then you research that rather than maybe something else. And that may be a universal concern, but that's a concern that comes up even when you're seeking, whether it's, and this is interesting, where do the funds come from? Do they come from the private sector or the state? And that's really something we're trying to uncover, and how that compares between the two continents. And then as far as why I did 4 regions and the regression, and I used 4 I did that to look at the regional differences for this conference because it's about comparative regional perspectives. But in my dissertation, I actually have one large, and I ran the regression one time with all the countries, and then I ran it again with dummy variables for 25 countries because there's not data on Greece and Luxembourg. And then a third time looking at the change between years on all the variables. But when I looked at all the countries together, the coefficients were the same. There was a significant negative employment relationship. GDP per capita was important but highly correlated, but R&D over GDP. And so that was why I did it here. And I have some other research to look at, I can tell you.
Well, about the new corporative provocativeness, I don't see the provocativeness in that. You know, I mean,
seen Valerie's face.
yeah, no, I saw that, and I understand
Yeah,
the perspective.
okay.
And as I pointed out, partly because of Valerie's reaction, is that word is not used in the COM document that I examined or the financial instrument regulations. They don't use the word neocorporatism, but I feel, I mean, if you read the documents, that's sort of what they're looking for, because they're saying it's very important to have the social partners, the economic partners negotiate with each other, which, okay, if it, what's the expression, if it walks like a duck and it speaks like a duck, then, you know, what is it? So they don't use the word because they understand corporatist arrangements are not universally accepted in all the member states. So yeah, maybe that's a very strong word, but this concept of the social partners working with each other is definitely in the Commission recommendation and in the regulations for, and it's not just for the neighborhood, it's for the entire development policy of the EU, because that one regulation is for the entire development policy of the EU. It's obvious that they want to encourage social partner cooperation. So I don't know if that's controversial, but I think that's what it is. And I could be wrong about that. We'll see. About the aha moment, okay, so we have two types of concerns. The first is in the literature, the first comes from the real world. So the literature seems to argue that these policies, the neighborhood policy, the Eastern Partnership, the Union for the Mediterranean, I mean, is generally useless, okay? And most of the analysis that we saw, so that you see that both in sort of news releases and, you know, the press, they say, you know, these are completely useless, or not completely, but they're not as useful as the Commission thinks they are. And then most of the literature examines those initiatives, but it looks primarily at government actors. So it looks at, you know, the government of Belarus talking to the government of Poland, or the government of Ukraine talking to the government of the European Commission. And we understand that relations between governments are sometimes very tense because they're very politicized. And so we thought, why don't we just look at it from a different perspective? Instead of looking at what governments do, let's see what non-governmental actors do if they actually cooperate. And our intention is to find out if this strategy is actually more effective than it looks like if you look at it from the non-state actor perspective and the state actor perspective. And it seems like we come to a different conclusion. So the previous literature says, yeah, these partnerships, they don't seem to be very effective. What we find is, wait, they are effective. It's just you need to look at what private actors do, and you have to look at it over time. And then you get a slightly different